General Hospital spoiler reveal that Diane stepped into the center of Michael's legal disaster, with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment long before anyone else realized how fragile the situation truly was. The trial had been built on half-truths, manipulated evidence, and a series of dangerous assumptions that had pushed the entire Corinthos Quartermain circle into a vortex of escalating fear. But the moment Diane uncovered the real reason behind Willow's involvement, the chilling truth that she, not Michael, had pulled the trigger on, Drew, everything inside Diane's mind shifted. It was not simply a revelation. It was a seismic adjustment to her understanding of the emotional landscape she was now navigating. Diane suddenly saw the trial as something larger than a simple assignment of guilt. It became a psychological battleground where loyalty, love, desperation, and survival instincts collided with cold legal reality. That knowledge forced her to reassess every strategy she had outlined until now, pushing her into a position where she could no longer afford to follow conventional paths. She knew she had to protect Michael, but she also understood that revealing Willow's guilt outright would unleash consequences that could devastate everyone involved. What unsettled Diane most was not the fact that Willow had fired the gun, but the way the truth had been buried beneath layers of fear, compassion, and self-preservation. This was no ordinary case of guilt. It was a tragic domino effect triggered by a moment of uncontrolled emotion. Willow's decision to hide what she had done had created a ripple of madness, small at first, then widening, then spiraling until it consumed the rational decision-making of every person touched by the event. Diane saw how deeply this secret had entangled Willow and Drew, placing both of them in an increasingly suffocating bind. Drew, torn between the fading clarity of his memories and the overwhelming desire for justice, was trapped in an emotional maze that twisted tighter each day. Willow, fragile but determined to maintain her innocence, was living under the crushing weight of a guilt she could not confess without losing everything she had fought for. And Michael, caught at the intersection of truth, lies, and family loyalty, was the one about to pay the highest price. Diane recognized the danger in the air as sharply as she would sense an oncoming storm. The case was no longer just a legal process. It had become a battlefield of shifting alliances, hidden agendas, and emotional implosions waiting to detonate. Every adjustment she made in her legal strategy had to account for the fragile psychological states of the people she was trying to protect. She saw clearly that Willow and Drew were being squeezed into a pressure chamber with no clear exit. The more the truth tried to surface, the more chaotic and irrational their behavior became. Willow's anxiety began to spill into her every choice, tightening her voice and clouding her judgment, while Drew's growing desire for accountability twisted into an obsession that threatened to swallow him whole. Diane knew the madness rising inside this story was not a dramatic metaphor. It was a real, palpable energy pressing against the walls of the courtroom and tightening around the lives of everyone trapped inside the fallout. As Diane pieced together the implications, she understood that the legal danger circling Michael was only the visible layer of a much deeper crisis. Beneath everything was an emotional war, silent, unspoken, and absolutely unforgiving. Michael's willingness to shield Willow, even at the cost of his own freedom, had become both his greatest strength and the fatal weakness Diane knew she must dismantle delicately. She needed to redirect the narrative without exposing Willow's guilt, a nearly impossible task for any attorney. But Diane had always excelled at navigating moral gray zones. She had to construct a defense built on precision, subtlety, and psychological leverage. It required her to take control of the courtroom narrative with an assertiveness that bordered on ruthless, because anything less would allow Turner to pivot aggressively toward Michael and destroy him with ease. But the more Diane uncovered, the more she sensed that this was not just a legal case spiraling out of control. It was an unraveling of relationships, trust, and identity. Willow and Drew were being crushed beneath the gravity of a secret neither had the strength to face openly, and the mounting paranoia surrounding them began contaminating every conversation, every glance, every breath exchanged between the people they loved. Diane felt the tremors of that fear whenever she looked into Michael's eyes, his confusion, his desperation to protect Willow, and his inability to understand how close he was to losing everything. She knew she had to become the stabilizing force, the anchor that prevented him from being swallowed by the chaos tightening around him like a noose. And yet, it was precisely because Diane knew the truth that she became even more determined to shield Michael. Instead of weakening her resolve, the revelation about Willow hardened it. Diane understood that controlling the narrative meant controlling the pace of the unraveling. If the truth emerged too quickly, it would destroy Willow. If it remained hidden too long, it would destroy Michael. That delicate balance kept Diane awake at night, piecing together solutions that felt increasingly fragile. Like a house of cards trembling under the weight of a rising wind, she crafted a new approach subtle enough to keep Willow's guilt concealed, strategic enough to cast reasonable doubt on Michael's involvement, and forceful enough to challenge the prosecution's confidence without tipping the scales too far. This shift in Diane's mindset marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict, a phase defined not by what was spoken, but by what was intentionally left unsaid. She moved through the legal proceedings with a quiet intensity, aware that every decision she made was shaping the fate of 3 lives connected by tragedy. The more chaotic the situation became, the more disciplined Diane remained. She sensed that the madness surrounding the case wasn't slowing down, it was accelerating, expanding like a storm cloud stretching across the sky. Each day brought a new complication, a new emotional fracture, a new ethical dilemma that tested Diane's resolve. Yet amid all this unraveling, Michael found something unexpected, support from Diane that went beyond typical attorney-client. Loyalty. Diane became his strategist, his protector, and in a strange way, the only person who truly understood the depth of the emotional battlefield he was fighting on. Even though she knew he was innocent, she also knew innocence meant nothing when buried under manipulated evidence. And a prosecutor desperate for a conviction, her determination to shield him, even while safeguarding Willow from exposure, created a strange but powerful alliance, an alliance built on mutual trust, unspoken truths, and a fierce commitment to survival. Diane's presence became the one steady force in the swirling chaos around Michael, giving him the strength he didn't know he had. Her strategic intelligence, emotional discipline, and ability to read every shift in the courtroom dynamic allowed Michael to breathe, even as the walls closed in, and as the madness of the situation intensified. Diane's control became the only thing preventing the entire case from exploding into irreversible disaster. The truth remained a ticking time bomb beneath their feet. Diane could feel it, Willow could feel it, Drew could feel it, and Michael lived unknowingly in the shadow of it. But Diane also knew something else: if she could maintain control just long enough, if she could hold the narrative steady while emotions raged dangerously close to the surface, then Michael might emerge from this nightmare free. And perhaps, when the storm finally broke, all 3 of them might find a way to survive the truth that bound them together in fear, guilt, and a desperate hope for redemption. Diane could feel the shift in the air long before she stood to speak. Something about the way the trial had unfolded, the rushed assumptions, the manipulated evidence, the unspoken fear told her that the courtroom was ready to fracture, and she intended to be the one to break it open. For too long, the truth had been held underwater by panic and misdirection, and now the moment had arrived for Diane to seize control of the narrative and drag that truth into the light. Nothing in her long career had prepared her for the emotional and moral labyrinth of this case. But nothing had ever sharpened her instincts quite like watching Michael Corinthos inch closer and closer to becoming the sacrificial lamb for a crime he did not commit. Diane knew the cost of silence. She knew the cost of fear. And she knew that if she didn't strike now, the system would devour Michael whole. So when she rose to her feet, there was no hesitation in her voice. Her presence changed the temperature of the room, reshaping the tension into something electric. Something charged with possibility and danger. Diane announced that the defense was prepared to demonstrate a profound miscarriage of justice, and immediately a rumble of unease spread through the courtroom. She was not merely questioning the prosecution's argument. She was calling out the integrity of the verdict itself. And every person in that room knew exactly what that meant. Diane was about to detonate a truth that had been suppressed long before the trial even began. She began by dismantling the jury's conclusion, not with aggression, but with a razor-sharp precision that silenced even the most skeptical observers. Diane argued that the jury had been misled, that they had reached a verdict clouded by emotional bias and manipulated evidence. She pointed directly to the inconsistencies that others had conveniently overlooked, and then, with a calm, deliberate tone that carried more weight than a shout ever could, she suggested the forbidden truth: Willow should have been convicted instead of freed. A collective gasp broke through the courtroom like a shockwave. The air went tight, and even the judge paused before regaining composure. Diane had crossed the threshold no one else dared approach. But Diane did not flinch. She pressed onward, revealing the cracks in the case against Michael and the overwhelming indicators that pointed to Willow as the true perpetrator. She knew that naming Willow would ignite fury, judgment, confusion, but she also knew that the truth was the only force strong enough to save Michael now. She had not come to this courtroom to comfort. She had come to correct, and so she shattered the silence with the revelation that the real shooter had walked out of the courtroom once already, shielded not by innocence, but by a verdict poisoned by deception. And then came the bombshell, the ringtone scandal. The moment Diane raised it, every person connected to the cover-up felt the walls closing in. Faces paled, muscles stiffened. This was the piece of evidence everyone had hoped would remain buried. But Diane was not going to let it die quietly. She announced that she was prepared to expose how the ringtone had been tampered with, how it misled investigators, and how it derailed the entire trial. That single piece of digital manipulation had become the shaky foundation on which an innocent man now stood accused. And Diane was not afraid to pull witnesses into the storm. Kai, Trina. The mere mention of their names sent a shiver through the courtroom. They both sat in the gallery, hearts pounding, each knowing that there was no longer room to hide. Diane subtly reminded the court that both young witnesses possessed information capable of turning the entire case on its head. Information that could confirm Willow's guilt and absolve Michael. Information that had been suppressed not out of malice, but out of fear of implicating themselves, fear of destroying someone they cared about, fear of becoming entangled in a tragedy spiraling beyond their control. Trina felt tears sting her eyes as Diane spoke. She had spent sleepless nights terrified that Jocelyn's brother might go to prison for something he had not done. The weight of that guilt had been crushing her. Kai, too, felt his stomach twist as the truth pressed against his conscience. Their silence was no longer protecting anyone. It was threatening to destroy an innocent man. Diane's words did not accuse them. She liberated them from the prison of fear they had been living in. They could step forward and speak the truth. They could end the nightmare. And in that moment, both understood that Diane had forced a reckoning they could no longer avoid. Still, even with Willow's guilt laid bare, Diane knew the cruel reality of the law. Willow could not be retried. Double jeopardy guaranteed her protection. Even if the entire world discovered what she had done, real justice would never touch her, not legally, not institutionally. But Diane wasn't here to punish Willow. She was here to save Michael, and she could still do that, even if the law could not reverse its mistake. Diane announced, with unwavering certainty, that Michael must be declared innocent. She hammered the point home by demonstrating how every piece of evidence used against him unraveled under scrutiny once Willow's involvement was acknowledged. The jury's original decision wasn't merely flawed, it was catastrophically wrong. Diane's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent her entire career fighting for the misunderstood, the underestimated, and the falsely accused. Michael watched her with a mixture of awe and disbelief. He had always trusted Diane, but he had never felt the full force of her brilliance until now. As she fought for him, it felt as though she was restoring something he thought he had lost forever: his dignity, his voice, his right to be seen as the man he truly was. Diane gave him the one thing no one else had been willing to fight for: his truth. But the shock Diane unleashed did not end with her demand for Michael's exoneration. The real impact lay in the subtle shift she introduced beneath the words. Her bold strategy had repositioned the entire narrative, placing Michael in a new light, no longer a passive victim of circumstance, but a man wronged by the system itself, a man deserving not just freedom, but vindication. And the ripples of that truth were already spreading. Turner, the prosecutor who had been so eager to pursue Michael, found herself cornered. Diane had exposed the gaps in her investigation, the overconfidence in the evidence, the unquestioning acceptance of a verdict that should never have been reached. Turner felt the humiliation pulse through her as she realized the trial was slipping from her grasp. Diane wasn't just winning, she was rewriting the story in real time. Meanwhile, Willow's world would soon begin to collapse under the weight of a truth she could no longer hide behind. Drew would be forced to confront the betrayal that had been festering beneath the surface, and the town of Port Charles, always hungry for scandal, would recoil at the realization that the wrong person had nearly been condemned. Yet amid all this chaos, something remarkable happened. Diane's willingness to risk everything gave Michael a kind of power he had never expected to possess. She had given him back his life. She had given him a shield against injustice. She had given him a second chance at freedom. And in doing so, she had created a shockwave that would change every relationship, every alliance, and every truth connected to this case. It was more than a legal defense. It was a reckoning, a turning point, a new beginning forged from the ruins of a broken verdict. And as Diane took her seat, the courtroom still frozen in stunned silence, everyone understood one thing. Nothing in Port Charles would ever be the same again. Turner had always believed she understood control. She had built her career on it: control of the courtroom, control of witnesses, control of the narrative. Even now, when the case had begun to warp under the pressure of truth and deception, Turner refused to accept the possibility that things were slipping away from her. She convinced herself that the power balance still shifted in her favor, that the prosecution held the reins even while cracks tore silently through the structure she had built. Standing at the bench, Turner projected the same cold confidence she always did, but beneath the surface was a tightening coil of fear. Every instinct she possessed warned her that Diane was preparing something sharp and devastating, something that could tear through the illusion of order Turner fought so desperately to maintain. But Turner refused to yield. She pushed forward with a relentless hunger, using every rule, every precedent, every inch of institutional weight behind her to force the case back into her control, as if sheer force of will could bend reality to her command. Yet Diane felt the tremors in Turner's certainty. She sensed the desperation hidden beneath the prosecutor's polished composure, and that subtle shift only sharpened Diane's determination. For Diane, this was no longer just a legal battle, it was a moral reckoning, a test of whether truth could survive in a courtroom drowning in misdirection. The more Turner tightened her grip on the case, the more Diane understood that she needed to change her approach, adjust her strategy, and strike where Turner least expected. She knew the prosecution's confidence was brittle, a thin shell hiding the fear that the wrong person was standing in the crosshairs. Diane felt it every time Turner's voice trembled for just a fraction of a second, every time she avoided direct eye contact during key statements, every time she reshuffled her papers in a hurry to appear composed. Turner was terrified not of Diane, and not even of losing the case, but of the truth that Diane was slowly excavating from underneath layers of false assumptions. Diane recognized that she needed more than arguments, she needed evidence strong enough to tear apart Turner's narrative from the inside. Every night, long after the courthouse lights dimmed, Diane returned to her office and pored through transcripts, recordings, case files, photographs, timelines, every piece of information the trial had produced. She dissected every word, every pause, every contradiction that pointed to the real trajectory of the crime and the real person who had fired the gun. The ringtone scandal became her anchor, the point where everything began to unravel. Diane knew that if she could expose the manipulation behind that key piece of evidence, Turner's entire case would collapse. But she also understood that Turner was fighting with a desperation she had never shown before. As if the truth Diane sought wasn't merely inconvenient, it was catastrophic. As Diane examined each document by the dim glow of her office lamp, she realized something deeper. Turner wasn't simply wrong, Turner was hiding something. Whether it was fear of professional humiliation, fear of losing control, or fear of facing the reality that she had nearly condemned an innocent man, Turner was operating in survival mode. And survival mode made people unpredictable, erratic, even dangerous. Diane knew she needed to move carefully, because exposing Turner too aggressively could cause the prosecutor to lash out and complicate the case even further. Still, Diane could not ignore the unraveling threads pulling her toward the truth. That truth was a living thing breathing, pulsing, waiting for the moment it could burst through the floor of the courtroom and change everything. Turner, aware on some level that Diane was uncovering something transformative, doubled down on her tactics. She controlled the courtroom with aggressive objections, calculated glances at the jury, and a rigid insistence that the case was airtight. She barked orders at her paralegals, rewrote her cross-examinations late into the night, and replayed the trial footage again and again, searching for weaknesses in Diane's approach. But each hour she spent trying to control the courtroom narrative only heightened the pressure. Inside her own mind, she could sense Diane circling, like a predator waiting for the exact moment when the prey dropped its guard. Turner felt haunted by the truth, haunted by the suspicion that she had built her entire case on the wrong foundation. This tension, Turner clinging to control, Diane shifting her strategy, became the heartbeat of the courtroom, a pulse visible to everyone present. Michael sensed it whenever Diane leaned forward with that quiet, lethal intensity in her eyes. Willow felt it through the rising panic clawing at her throat each time Turner insisted. The shooter had to be Michael. Drew recognized it in Turner's stiff posture, her trembling jaw, her refusal to acknowledge that she was losing ground. Even Kai and Trina sensed it, two young witnesses who carried the weight of a truth they had been too afraid to speak aloud. They watched Turner, watched Diane, watched the tension grow thicker with every passing moment, and they knew the collision was coming. Diane's search for new evidence quickly shifted from analysis into obsession. She needed proof strong enough to break Turner's control, proof that would shake the courtroom and force the judge, the jury, and even Turner herself to confront the truth that had been smothered under fear and silence. She revisited every angle of the ringtone scandal, reconstructing the timeline with a precision so sharp it felt surgical. She noticed micro details others had dismissed: the timing of the call, the glitch in the audio file, the inconsistent statements from those who claimed to have heard it. Every small detail formed a pattern, and every pattern pointed to manipulation. Diane began to feel the weight of a new truth forming, one that would not only undermine Turner's authority, but expose the entire trial as a distorted reflection of justice. And Turner felt the shift like a cold hand closing around her throat. The more evidence Diane uncovered, the more unstable Turner became. Her objections grew sharper, her tone more aggressive, her patience thinner. She snapped at minor procedural errors, attempted to shut down witnesses prematurely, and even ignored the judge's warnings when she pushed too hard. Turner could feel her grasp on the case slipping, and instead of adjusting, she clung harder. That desperation became visible to everyone: sweat at her temples, the slight tremor in her hands, the frantic way she flipped through her notes before speaking. She kept telling herself she was still in control, but deep down, she knew the center was collapsing. But Diane's strategy was not born from Turner's weakness. It was born from Diane's relentless pursuit of the truth. She was guided not by ego or ambition, but by the need to restore balance to a system that had failed. As she pieced together the final fragments of evidence, she felt the enormity of the shock that was coming. This was not just a correction. It was not just a revelation. It was the kind of truth that would send the courtroom into chaos, the kind that would shatter reputations, friendships, alliances, and perhaps even families. But Diane knew it was necessary. If she was to save Michael, she had to tear down the lie that had nearly destroyed him, and that lie was the beating heart of Turner's case. When Diane finally rose to present her findings, the courtroom felt as if it were holding its breath. Turner glared at her with the kind of fear that transformed into hatred, but Diane didn't flinch. She began revealing the inconsistencies, exposing the manipulated evidence, highlighting the impossible timeline, and pointing directly to the truth Turner had worked so hard to suppress. Every sentence Diane spoke tightened the invisible rope around Turner's control. Every revelation cracked the foundation beneath her feet. The shock that followed was exactly the one Diane had anticipated. The courtroom fell silent, not out of confusion, but out of the dawning realization that everything they thought they knew about the case was wrong. Turner's expression collapsed into something between horror and disbelief. Michael felt tears sting his eyes as hope returned after so long in darkness. Willow trembled. Drew froze. Kai and Trina exchanged a glance that told Diane they were finally ready to speak. And in that moment, The courtroom no longer belonged to Turner. It belonged to the truth Diane had unearthed, a truth powerful enough to change everything that came next.